All right, good people. Well, welcome to another fantastic day of web dev programming. I'm your host in this lovely game show, Cam Flowers. Thank y'all for joining me again. Yeah, I'm saying. Before we get started, y'all know the vibes in the chat. I'd love to know how you're feeling. 1 to 5, 5 being, hey, it's lit today. 1 being like, it is the worst day of my life. How are y'all? I'd say right now, I'm probably 4.5, you know what I'm saying? Like, zero point 0.5 could be better, but for the most part, everything good, everything Gucci on my side. How are you? How are y'all doing? Ooh, I can see it's not the best day today. I see it. I feel y'all. I feel those vibes, yo. I feel you. Salif, I feel you, fam. Amber, I feel you, fam. Samuel, I feel y'all. It's not. It's a. It's a hard day. Yeah. I see you though, Alex, and I see the folks that are doing well. Yeah, I feel you. Hey, my man Chris, I need to get some of your energy so we can get to that all-time high for real, for real. But yeah, thanks to the folks that shared in the chat. I appreciate y'all. So today, here's what I want to do. I want to give us an opportunity to continue down this path of building out our React applications to the point that we can see how to do this with multiple pages. Last time we linked up, we started building a pretty simple application using Vite, and Vite is just a React library to create new React applications, and it uses the command line to help scaffold a React project for us to use. So we did a little bit of scaffolding of that project and ended up at the end of our last session with an application similar to this, where essentially we had a basic running React application. And on the application, we had a button, a series of buttons that a user could choose. And based on whatever option they chose, we could see some text changing. Now, this might not look like the most sophisticated, significant thing, but under the hood, what we're doing is exposing a very fundamentally important React concept, which is called conditional rendering. And conditional rendering is essentially the process of us using JavaScript in order to switch what React components are shown at different points in time. So in this case, if you could think about it in a big picture way, we have one big component for this message that you're seeing at the bottom here. And whenever the options get changed at the top, these options trigger this message component to switch and change to be something else. Now, as you can see, right, it seems kind of interesting in that, like, right now, each option changes the text to be a different option, clearly. But what's unique about this is, if you think about it, we're changing visual elements on the screen, but the page itself is never reloading, right? It's just kind of the elements that are on the screen are changing, but the page itself, it's not as if I go up here and I just reload the whole page and everything changes, right? How we accomplish this type of dynamic rendering, if you will, right? The dynamic rendering of content is a very important in React. And like I said, this kind of exposes a fundamental design pattern, but also an important understanding of how different libraries work to make our React applications a bit more sophisticated. So let's take a quick deep dive back into like what the code looks like for this. And then from there, talk about, well, with the knowledge that we have on conditional rendering and how something like this works, how might libraries or solutions to creating multi-page applications work in general. So let's just switch over. I'm going to just pull up the VS Code for this application. And as y'all can see, we're just taking a look right now at this running Vite application. So remember, Vite is just a particular React library command line tool that helps us launch a new project. By using Vite, you can create a new project in React that is already scaffolded with the necessary files that you need, as well as the necessary scripts to run to get a local React server up. So for me, I use the Vite command line to create all of these files that you see on the left-hand side in VS Code. And my job after creating that scaffold is to build the functional components that I need to show the user interface that we were just looking at. So to take a quick dive into the code is actually very simple. We've only really been making changes into two files. So let's just pull this out so we can just see these files a little bit better, right? So the first file that we've been changing is our app.jsx. And this is actually the main component. If you think of how this React application is working, this app is the main component that we're using to render visual elements on the screen. The way we know that is because the Vite application created a main.jsx file for us, and this proves to us that our app component, right, the component being imported from our app.jsx file, this component is by and large the component being rendered into our HTML document, right? We talked a lot about how these particular methods work with React, where we are creating a series of React components that are going to be rendered into our HTML document using the document object model in some previous sessions and videos. But basically, the main.jsx file in a Vite application will tell you which component is your main component being rendered, right? And the idea of components is this, right? Me saying that I'm rendering the app means that any components inside of the app that finally get returned are going to be the components that get rendered also onto the screen, right? So just because my main is saying, hey, I'm going to render this app component, means that, hey, whatever I define in the app component will be what eventually will be taken into my HTML and turned into like the visual elements on the screen. This is where we have all of the different parts of the UI that you probably just saw, right? So we have our little message that was at the top, choose an option for your message. We have our two buttons that the user could click in order to change the options. And then we have our message component, right? And the second component that was the other important component we worked on was this message component, which essentially is just its own file that is returning a very simple heading. And the heading is receiving some data and saying, hey, I'm going to show whatever the data is that you told me to show, right? We use props because in order to pass data from one component, so from our app.js to our message component, we have to use a React concept called props, where we pass some data, and you know, I coincidentally named this data. It could be named whatever, but we can pass a prop into a component that we're building and pass some data into that component as well. By doing this, that component, so our message component in this case, has the opportunity to receive some props. And by receiving some props, it can then use that data in its own render, in its own statements, in its own function body, right? So anything in between these yellow curly braces is part of the function. And because this function is receiving props as an argument, it can then use the props, whether it's to render something, and we're going to render this H1 with some of the data, or even before we return, right? You know, we could do certain things like, oh, well, console log, you know, props data, sorry, right? And this would be also a logical way of us using props, right? Using the props and calling it in certain functions before we return our actual data or whatnot. So whether we're using the props specifically for rendering something with that data, or we're just kind of, because we're inside of a function and we might want to do certain things with that data and, like, you know, print it in this case, right? All that to say that if a component receives some props, you can use the props throughout the function, and that's important, right? For us, we only really are using this props for showing the data in the heading. So that's what we see here on line 5. Going back to our app real quick. So clearly the message component is receiving some data that will be called message data. And how is this application really working? Well, we have these two buttons, right? One button has a value of 1, one button has a value of 2, and each of these buttons are calling a function whenever they get clicked. So we use this onClick handler to call this function whenever something happens, right? Whenever this click event happens. So both buttons are calling the same function. It's called handle button click, and that's defined a little bit above here between lines 11 and 25. Handle button click is essentially an event handling function. Because it's an event handler function, and I'll just comment that up here so folks know what I'm saying. This is our click event handler. So this handle button click function is a function that we passed into our JSX element for buttons and said, hey, whenever a button is clicked, right? An on click is the event that we're triggering, that would trigger a particular function, right? So whenever the on click event triggers a response, right? What we're basically saying in the way that this is structured is whenever a click happens on a button, we're going to call handle button click essentially, right? And handle button click then is going to be called. And one of the things that any function that is an event handling function, right? So whether it's clicks, drags, hovers, mouse overs, all the different types of events that happen on the web, whenever any of those events get called or triggered, they pass into the handling function an object that we call an event. This event object has certain pieces of data about the actual event that took place. So it will give us some information about the click itself, or about the what element in the HTML triggered this event. What are some of the attributes of that element? What are some of the what pixels on the screen got clicked? Like we have all that data at our fingertips using this object that gets passed in to the function. One of the pieces of information that this object contains, like I said, is what element triggered the event. And that is the event.target. This dot right here, event.target, will always show us like what element or object in our HTML triggered the actual event that ended up calling this function. Because this is going to give us back an element, we can then do things like look at the attributes on that element in order to get some data, right? And so if we think back to here, like I said, I had created a button. A button is a regular JSX element. Remember, JSX is just the JavaScript markup syntax that we can use in our React components in order to create visual elements in JavaScript. And the button itself, right, as a JSX element, we define the click, but we also define an attribute for a value. And we said, hey, this button has a value of 1. Value is an attribute that you can also pass into your elements. And these JSX elements will receive those values, and that will also translate into HTML for us as well. Long story short, because each button has its own value as an attribute, whenever the click happens, it will call our handle button click function, right? That event object gets passed back whenever the click event happens, such that we are able to take a look at, well, which element called us and what is the value that that element has, right? Because we set the value here, we can make reference and look at the value here. And looking at the value here then allowed us to say something like, well, hey, if that value of that index was 1, right? Well, we can change some data to say, hey, we're going to be option 1. Otherwise, if the value is different, we're going to change that message to be option 2, right? You chose option 2. Otherwise, it'd be like you chose something else, which we don't actually see because we don't have a condition where the button index will be something other than 1 or 2, given the way that this is structured. We have 2 buttons, they're either 1 or 2, and we have our message data, right, being set. So let's talk a little bit about the message data being set, right? Because that's the other interesting part of how we structured this, where we were using what we call state in order to hold some data that eventually is going to be changed in this component, right? So the way that state works is every component has the opportunity to define what we call state. And state is essentially the component keeping a record of itself and data about itself that will change as the component change in different settings of the component, right? So realistically, what we are attempting to do is say, hey, well, we have this message data, and this message data is going to hold some information related to what the message is on our screen at different points in time, right? The value of the message data component, the value of this message data will always be changing based on us calling a function inside of our code later, right? So the way that the state object works in React, you have a variable or object that's going to hold the data, right? You have a function that is going to be, you are able to call at different points in times to change that data, and then you have your default value of that data itself. In this case, we have message data as the actual value, set message data as the function that will trigger and set the state to be something different. It's an action for changing the state. And then we have the default value of the state, or the initial value of the state, set to no option selected. This is what allows for us to, in our code base, start the app off with no option selected as the message. Then if the option 1 gets clicked, we can switch, because in the code we're saying, hey, if the button click, right, if the value of that button is 1, index 1, we know that button 1 hit us. So here is where we use the state function to set the data to say, well, change the message to be this, right? You chose option 1, right? And again, if the button index gets clicked for button option 2, then that's when we see set message data get set to you chose option 2, which is exactly why if we go back to the app and click option 2, we see it toggle and change to this, right? Anytime a button gets clicked, that button event handling function happens, and it changes the message data based on, it sets the state of the message data to be something else, because of the fact that message data is clearly going to be changing. This is a state value, right? So the component will be setting that state and changing that state over time. Because message data is a value that is going to be changing, this is the interesting design pattern that you're going to be, that's really important for y'all to see right quick, right? We clearly created a value in state. The purpose of creating a value in state is that, hey, this component or other components might end up trying to change this data. We might need to change this data, and the component needs to know that this data is different, right? But it only can change the data if we call this function, set message data, right? So clearly when the buttons get clicked, we're calling that function and setting that data to be different. But how this really works is that we passed into our message. Remember, we said, hey, the message is receiving some props with some data, right? Well, here we're giving it data, right, that is set to be the message data. And remember, message data is this piece of information that is going to change based on the user's interaction with our site. So we're basically passing a dynamic piece of data to a component as props. That in and of itself is the design pattern in React that is very important for y'all to know, right? Us passing dynamic data that is being changed using state to another component as props. So we know about props, we know about state, right? But what we're seeing on line 35 is us passing state value to another component as props. What that will end up doing is that anytime, right, anytime the message data changes, right, so anytime we call set message data to change the message data value, that means that this data is going to be different, right? And that means that if that data is different, then this props.data that this component is receiving is going to be different. Because the value of the props are going to change, because of the value of the state object is going to change, this makes it so that our component will refresh and I shouldn't say refresh. This makes it so our component re-renders all of the values of itself. And because it re-renders, that's what gives us this visual, hey, one thing is changing, things are changing without the page fully reloading. Now, again, This is a common design pattern in React that you're going to end up having to get used to, because in order to make it so that components can respond to some of the changes taking place in other components, you need to use props and you need to use state. Those are our only two ways of changing data within React applications, right? We use props when we want to send data from one component, like this two highlights, to another component, like our message component. We use props, right, to say, hey, I want to tell this other component something, right? But we use state in order to keep data that might change inside of one component, so that we can either use that data inside of a component or pass that as props to another component and basically give a component dynamic data that will change over time, right? And just to reiterate this point one more time, when I say dynamic data versus not dynamic data, I basically mean, remember, with this message, I can define this prop to be whatever. So if I were to say, you chose something, question mark, right? Well, the thing is that this particular value is hard coded. So this is static. So what's going to happen is the data here is static. So it's not ever going to change, right? In order to have this be dynamic and changing, I need to pass it some data instead of passing it this string that can never really change, passing it something like message data, which clearly is a object that will be changing over time based on actions happening in our component, right? That's what allows us to have that more dynamic experience and have the UI basically, quote unquote, react to the changes being made through the interactions that the user is performing, right? This, like I said, is a common design pattern in React where you create state. The component has some record of some data that's going to be there, and certain interactions or things will change that data. And another component might subscribe to getting that data from props. But what's happening is this component will be receiving data that might change based on what's going on inside of this first component. Passing state as props is a common practice when you are going to be having components connected and the data changing in one component becomes important for another component to work with. So that's a quick recap of what we got to so far. So just give me a thumbs up if what I'm saying is making sense to you, what you're seeing is making sense to you. And it would be great to know if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. I would very much appreciate that. And I'll take some time right quick to answer any questions that y'all have. But yeah, y'all, what we're looking at is essentially some of the most important beginning concepts of how to work with React. You can't do much without props. You can't do much without state when it comes to working with React applications. But the value of working with these React applications is that we can really create these very dynamic applications that change over time in very unique and fast ways, right? Responsive and dynamic ways. Cool. So not seeing any comments or questions in the chat, so I'm just going to use this as an opportunity to keep pushing forward. And since y'all don't have a question, I have a question for you. Based on what I just told you, right? And, I'm not going to make y'all type this in the chat, but I would, what I'm saying? I would, but I'm just going to give this to y'all as a thought exercise. Based on what I just told you and what we're seeing happening here with relationship to this particular example of conditional rendering or whatnot, how do you think we could accomplish, in your own idea, based on what you're seeing, how do you think we could accomplish creating a multi-page-esque site using React, right? Based on what you're seeing right here, how do you think that we could theoretically create a multi-page site? If you have a thought and you want to drop it in the chat, that's cool. If you want to raise your hand, come off mute and share an answer, that's also cool. But this is mostly meant for you to think to yourself and ask yourself, how can we create what we're seeing here to be to allow for us to accomplish something like, hey, I'm going to one part of a site to another part of a site, etc. Gotta give you like a couple seconds to, let that percolate. give, give you a couple seconds to let that percolate real quick. So some folks are saying in the chat, well, we could make like a link component maybe, or some active links, right? Well, that's actually interesting, right? And honestly, you're all are onto something there, right? Well, you might be maybe what Chris means by creating a link component is like, well, think of these buttons, right? What if we thought of these buttons as links, right? And we were like, oh, well, this is one link to a page, this is another link to a page, right? And if I click this link, I would want this to be showing that page and this to show a separate page. And maybe that's what blessing means when they're talking about active links, right? So based on whatever is actively the link of where I am, I would want a certain type of component to render. Exactly. They're like, yeah, okay, yeah. What y'all are talking about is, and Nora says the same thing, by creating multiple pages and connecting them with links. Exactly, right? Like if we had different components as pages, right? We could use this same concept that we've already created here to create kind of a multi-page-esque application, right? By doing this, it would be almost as if we're saying, hey, instead of just this message changing, what if everything changed on this particular component, right? To show you how that might be the case and how you could theoretically do this with what we know so far, think of it like this, right? Our app.jsx right now is responsible for rendering everything we're seeing on the screen, right? Theoretically, what folks are talking about is we clearly have one section in our app that is a series of buttons, right? And what folks are saying is, well, what if these buttons, instead of like option one, this was like our homepage, or this was about us, you know what I'm saying? And right, in that case, then we're creating almost like a little nav bar for ourselves. Maybe we don't have this little choose an option thing, right? So let me just knock this out for a sec. Oops, let's do this. Right, we could have a couple different links, active links going on, and almost create a setup for ourselves. And let's do something like home about us. Maybe we add another one like dashboard, right? And based on whatever option is being chosen, right, we could have a series of different components that are going to render for us. Instead of it just being a message, right, this whole message component could be very significantly an entire page, right? And that's what's fascinating, right? Instead of the message component just being a just returning one heading of text, right? We could design this message component to be in fact its own page, and to show that page based on whatever's going on internal to the app, right? Now, of course, to really accomplish something like this, we would have to change what we're doing currently with the styling. Again, the styling stuff is happening in places like our app.css, where we're defining how our content is structured, as well as in our index.css, where things like our H1 and our body are getting defined as well, right? So if we were to take away some of these designs, of course, we could make this feel and look more like a actual app with a series of kind of active links and responsive kind of page components that are going to show the values of whatever each of those things are. If that makes sense to you, based on what I've talked to you about so far, just give it a thumbs up, right? We could use the same concept in order to accomplish a similar kind of design for creating a multi-page application. If you get that based on what you just saw, hey, that is the joy of teaching. State and props could help us accomplish this. That's the biggest takeaway I want you to have right quick, right? We could accomplish the idea of having these components render using state and props if we change what we were just doing up just a little bit to say, hey, like each of these things might accomplish something different with state, and that might change what piece of data we're sending to almost like a page component, instead of a message component, right? It could be somewhat simple like this. Cool. Somebody has a quick question, so let's turn to that real fast, and then we'll keep it rocking, man. You, any questions? Yo. Oh, well, maybe that was maybe that wasn't a question. That was just like a little mess up. But y'all get the vibes. So what we're doing is essentially changing the value of what we're rendering based on props, right? We're passing some props into here, but we're changing what prop gets sent in based on changes in the state. So the state of what link is active might change what page we see. That's how we could take what we were doing previously with a message, to change this kind of structure to work similarly to what we're talking about here, right? So that's an interesting piece of information for us, right? Well, clearly, state and props can be used to allow us to accomplish a great deal with conditional rendering. And of course, we could, in a way, build out whole applications using kind of our own components for links and our own ability for us to tell what is the active link, and then create some kind of component switching that will conditionally render, say, hey, if our link is home, show this. If our link is about us, show that. If our link is dashboard, show something else, right? We could theoretically build this based on what y'all are just saying right now in the chat. The good news is we don't have to build this ourselves. We actually, there are actually libraries that are that folks have designed and built for specifically managing this particular part of the puzzle with relationship to creating multi-page applications. And wink, wink, how it works is exactly how y'all are talking about, right? It's using information in the state and to send props that basically communicate what are the active links and active parts of our routing, so that we can say, hey, I want to show this component versus another component. The tool and library that allows us to do this and allows other React applications to do this is React-Router. And React-Router is essentially a library that's built for React applications in order to allow for us to create navigation in our React applications. So React-Router has a number of different features that we can use. Some of them you can see on the right-hand side. So routes, nested routes, dynamic segments, which allows for us to create routes that have particular dynamic kind of data inside of them. Active links, right? So to tell like which things in the navigation are active, right? Relative links based on a series of different routes, right? Redirects, all types of stuff, right? There's a good amount of things built into this library. Clearly you can see, right? If we were to build this ourselves, it would take us a good amount of time to get something this sophisticated. But at the end of the day, like I said, how it's working is using some of the same concepts that we were talking about, where we're gotta build a series of components that will allow for us to know, hey, what particular route is active, is what link is active, and that link will correspond to a particular route. Based on that route, we can show particular elements. So what you're looking at here is a little bit of React code to create a series of routes for our application. In this case, and we're going to pull this into our code in a second. In this case, what we're seeing is we have an application that might have a couple different paths, right? It might have a home page and it might have an about page, right? And these routes will require different React elements to show up. And each element might be their own components that we want to show when a user is at a particular path. So we're going to use today, we're going to go ahead and work through the React Router library and add some of its core features into the little application that we have. But I wanted to point out to y'all that there are a number of really cool tutorials and examples in the React Router library as well that you can use and follow in order to kind of build even more sophisticated things than what we'll do in our little example today. Cool things ahead. So first, what I'd love for y'all to do is go ahead and start off by pulling up your version of this application that we have. And when you're ready, just raise your hand so I know that you have something up, and we'll take it from there. Cool. So I'll give it a couple minutes for folks to launch their version of the app. And when we got a good amount of folks, then we'll keep it going. Thank y'all to those who are already doing it. So for the folks who might not have a Vite app running or something, I'm gonna put a link in the chat again to the to just kind of the basic Vite application. Of course, if you don't have something, you can follow along and try your best to just kind of add the pieces as we go. But yeah, it would be good for you to try your best to get something running so you can try this out yourself in your own way. It'll just be helpful for you. But cool. So we'll give it 60 more seconds and then we'll get it rocking. Appreciate y'all for your time and your patience. You know the vibes. Cool. I don't think that was a whole 60 seconds, but I see it's got to the minute. So we'll get it rocking. So here's what I want y'all to do in whatever version of the code you're working on, whether it's in VS Code or it's in Stack Blitz, please just navigate to the code that you got in front of you. And you should have, in either case, a couple of different files that we'll be working in order to get our app working. We got this main.jsx. We should have some app.jsx. And that's really for now the most important. We'll come back to what we have in this component situation and whatnot in a bit. But for now, so long as you have a project that has that you can start with Vite. So create a new Vite application or use existing Vite application in order to start a new project. Either would be cool so that you can get this default default setup file setup. And boom. So what we're gonna do in order to move this kind of project forward from where we are to kind of a more using some of this really interesting React library to allow for us to build multi-page web app is this. First thing we want to do is we want to, like I just mentioned, create an application and have an application running, right? And so if you don't have an application with Vite, just make sure you launch one, and you can do that by way of using the terminal and using the create Vite command in order to launch a new project for yourself. And so that command is essentially npm create Vite at latest. And when you run this command, it will run you through an entire little project scaffold where you say, hey, I want to build a React project, etc. And when you do that, you'll end up with this folder structure like what we're seeing here. If you already have one, that's great. We're just going to work off the one we already have. If you can't get it, then I'll share a link to the Stack Blitz where you can work off one that's already made, but want to fix your terminal so we can get this going yourself too. Either way, once you have your application, right, step one is complete. We're ready to go, right? The next thing we want to do is we want to leverage the external library that is the React-Router library. And the React-Router library essentially is an external library, which means that it has packages that we can install into our project, and those packages are going to contain some of the most important components and whatnot to allow for us to do routing in our application. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to get our React router. We're going to get our React router into our code base. So what you want to do is navigate to a open terminal for your project. So in my case, because I have this project open in VS Code, I want to just open a new terminal in VS Code, which will open me up in that particular folder. Again, if you have another terminal, another way of using a terminal, then please just make sure you navigate in the terminal to the project folder that you have for this particular project you're working in. You'll know that you're in that particular project folder if you see that you can look by way of like your package.json and say, okay, hey, the name of this project is this, and I would want to confirm that that is the same thing as the folder that I'm looking at. However you open the terminal, just make sure you're in the right folder that contains your project, all of the Vite files that you got built. So that's the first step. So when y'all get there, just open up a new terminal. Just give me a quick thumbs up so I know that y'all rocking with me and we're ready to go, and we will keep it pushing. Cool. Inside of the terminal, wherever your code was defined, inside of that terminal, right? You can confirm you're in the right folder by typing ls and pressing enter, and you should see all of the files and folders that were created by the Vite command. If you don't see this and you just see something that maybe is the name of the project, that means you need to, like, for instance, if I were outside of this folder, right, and I ran this ls and I see something like Oh, multi-page Vite, right? Well, clearly I'm in the wrong folder, right? So what I have to do to get to the right folder is say CD and then the name of the folder in order to get into the right folder. Again, I could type LS to just confirm, okay, I'm looking at these files for my Vite project. I am in the right place. And when I know I'm in the right place, then what I want to do is I want to install the React Router package into this particular project. And now to do that, I'm just going to run a very simple npm command to add a new package. And that command is npm install, and let me actually clear this up so it's easier for y'all to see, right? So the command I'm going to run is npm, right? And you should be looking right here, npm install react router dom. And let me just close this up a bit so y'all can see this. So this command npm install react router dom is going to install the React Router package into our project. And take a look before we run this, you'll see there's a couple different packages already, dependencies already in here, right? But once I go ahead and I run this command in the terminal, we're going to see a couple places update. One place is here in our package.json where the React Router DOM is now added. And what that did was added a new package essentially into our node modules folder, which is this big folder that has all of the packages that we need to run our React applications. Now, looking at this, and I want y'all to do this for yourself, so go ahead and knock this out. But looking at this, right, as y'all are doing this, you can see, oh, well, there's the React Router DOM and then there's the React DOM, right? What is the difference? So we'll talk about that in a quick second, but go ahead and install React Router DOM into your project. And when you have it installed, go ahead and raise your hand so I know that y'all are on the same page as me. So again, just as a little recap, all you have to do this is make sure you're in the right folder in the terminal, right, for your project. And then you want to run npm install react-router-dom. That will install the package for you, and you can confirm that it worked by going to the package.json for your project, and you should see these dependencies inside of your package. These first two you should have already had installed. This next one should be kind of the last one installed for you, react-router-dom. If you go into a package.json and you don't see this, chances are you're in the wrong folder, and you just need to make sure you're in the right folder for your Vite application when you run the command. Cool. Again, we'll give it another couple seconds, 30 seconds or so, and then we'll keep it pushing. All right, good people. So thank y'all so much for those of y'all who raised your hands. Appreciate that. So here's what we're going to do. Now that we have the React Router DOM library installed, let's take a look again at the documentation for the React Router DOM library and figure out what are we going to need in order to create a router inside of our application. But first, like I mentioned, you might be looking at the package.json and you're seeing that there's these different packages that kind of sound similar. We have the React DOM and the React Router DOM, and you're like, well, what is the difference between React-DOM? Or you might be like, well, if I have React-DOM, do I really need React-Router-DOM? And the answer is yeah. Both of these are necessary packages for what we're trying to accomplish. Essentially, the React-DOM is a library that we use that has essentially the necessary packages for, like you see here on VS Code, right? The necessary packages for working with the DOM in React. Now, the working with the DOM in React, they're talking about the document object model. Remember, the document object model is the JavaScript API that we use in order to communicate between JavaScript files and an HTML file. And when we were looking at our main.jsx, right, we saw that there were a couple of methods that we were using in order to essentially render our components onto the screen. And in this case, right, the methods we were using came off of an object called React DOM, right? The React DOM object is a part of that React DOM library that we were just seeing. And the React DOM library basically creates this object that we can use in order to work with the necessary methods to render our components on the screen, right? So that's what the React-DOM library is and dependency is for. That's why we need that one. React-Router-DOM is a little different. This is the package that focuses on making it so our router and all of the necessary components that we want to use to navigate things in our application can also change aspects of our DOM. So two important libraries, they have similar names, but they're doing two completely different things. When you start getting in a place of, I want to have multiple pages and links and navigation in my app, that's when you're going to use the React-Router-DOM package. Whereas whenever you're launching a React application, you're going to need at least these first two to get the React application up and running. If that makes sense, just give me a quick thumbs up. I just wanted to point that out because I know that might be a little confusing when you're like, oh, like, dang, what is this? Yeah, no problem. I got y'all. All right, cool. So let's go back to the documentation and take a look at what kind of goes on in the process of creating a router, right? So what you'll see here is the aspect that we're creating is called client-side routing. And basically, this allows for us to, like I was mentioning, create paths that our application can follow, and those paths will coordinate to specific components that are going to get rendered on the screen. So if we take a look at this kind of solid little example here, and in a second we'll build our own, there's a couple pieces that we need in order to do this, right? The first piece is we need this thing called a browser router, right? And a browser router, and we'll dive into it in a second a little bit deeper, is essentially a component that will be responsible for managing all of the navigation inside of our application. It will be responsible for, as you see here, we're creating this browser router that is going to be essentially an object that's defining all of the necessary paths for our application to follow, as well as the element or the component that will be returned or basically I should say rendered whenever we go to that particular path, right? So the router is essentially an object defining the valid paths that we can follow and the components and elements that are going to be returned in that particular path. So that's the first thing. The router provider is then actually the component that takes that object as some data, as some prop, right? And it creates essentially a component that we can render that has all of these routes defined and are able to essentially navigate to. Each of these components each of these components will allow for us to create these particular each of these components will allow for us to create the necessary paths that we need and what we call routes that will show up in our application as folks are navigating with it. And the library also contains some specific other components like links to allow for us to achieve what y'all were talking about before, which is, hey, maybe we can create these buttons to be actual links, and those links will show, or will essentially help us do some of that navigation. So these are the kind of core components of how React Router's library works. It clearly defines a couple different objects and components, right? We can always tell the difference between a component and an object based on just things like, hey, this is a capitalized object name. Whenever we see things that are capitalized like this in React, it's a good sign that we're dealing with a custom component. So we'll use these components in our own little application in order to create our own little router and start trying to make some components that we can render whenever the router sees those particular paths are being created. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to swap over to our VS Code. Sorry, I cut the stream too quick, but we're going to swap back over to VS Code. And what I want you to do is navigate to your main.jsx file. And this is where we'll spend a good amount of time defining the router and building out the necessary capabilities for this particular router to hold the data for our code. So what we'll do is inside of this main.jsx file, we're going to actually create a little router for ourselves. And so the first thing we want to do, and I'll do it first and then y'all can follow along, is the first thing we got to do is we got to bring in those two methods the method that we saw to create a router, and we need to allow for ourselves to create that router as a component that can be rendered onto in our app. So to do this, we're going to, at the top here, we're going to import a part of the library. So we're going to import create browser router from react-router-dom. So this line right here is going to import that function that we were taking a look at, create browser router, that created, if you remember, an object called a router that defined all of the different routes for us inside of our application. The router will use that router in order to tell the app components what components need to be rendered in different capacities. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new router, and we're going to do that by way of, basically before we end up rendering anything to the screen, we're going to use this create browser router function in order to create a router. And that's going to look a little something like this, right? So a router is just going to be a little object that we're creating, and that router is going to get back the value of this function create browser router as we're passing into that create browser router an array of different paths with different elements tied to it. And so here's an example of a router, and this particular router is going to return back simply a little div with hello world when we go to this path. And we'll see what that means in a second, but in order to finish this up, in order for us to see something, there's one more step we have to do, right? So first step was import create browser router from React-Router-DOM. The second was to create a router that has at least a path and element defined, at least one path and element defined in it. The last step is we need to actually make this a renderable, we need to make this router something that can be rendered, something that can be rendered into our React DOM. To do that, we can make use of a component that comes built into React Router DOM, which is called a router provider, right? And a router provider is essentially a component in React Router DOM that is going to allow for us to create a router that will render the appropriate element for us as a component. So instead of our app component here, what I'm actually going to do is return instead of the app, just that router provider with the router properly being tied to the router that we defined here. And this is a closed component, so it doesn't have to wrap anything, but I'm going to just close that component up here like this, and that'll be it. For now, once I save this, let's just make sure that it's working. I'm gonna go back to Cali, and cool. So save this, and then if I go back to our Vite app, we should see at localhost 5173, hello world, just like this. So let's go back to what y'all need to do, right? Inside of your main.jsx, after you installed the React Router DOM package, you can import create browser router. We're going to create a new router using that function. Then after we created that router, you can use the router provider in order to pass that router in as a prop. And the prop will get a name called router. And we will be able to, once you save this, you should be able to see, once you refresh your browser's window, hello world like this. So change up your main.jsx, and when you see the same thing as I'm seeing, just raise your hand so I know that we're in the same place. And as always, if you're having any trouble or any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat, and I'd be happy to help you try to troubleshoot it. Thanks y'all for those y'all sharing your raising your hands. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. It is good to see that some of the folks are getting to where we got to go. Just again to recap, all we did was we installed the React Router DOM package, right? To do that, we ran that command in the terminal npm install React Router DOM, right, in the VS Code terminal. And then that installed some packages for us from React Router DOM. And all we need to do in order to start creating a router for our application is, one, we need to use this function, create browser router, which is going to take in a series of routes for us. Each of those routes are going to have a path and a particular element that will be returned for that path. In this case, I kind of just defined the element with just a very simple div that says hello world. And once we created that router, then we were able to create a router provider using this component from the React Router DOM package as well. Pass in a prop called router with the name of the router we created. So if I had called this new router, for instance, I would want this to say new router, right? Whatever we name this, we want to call the name in the prop. But either way, the router provider takes in a router and it will do the work of showing that router on the screen. So when you save and refresh, you should see, much like I saw, this hello world show up on the screen. So appreciate that from those of y'all who are following along. Thank you. And again, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in a chat or stick around and after we knock this out, we will. I'm happy to help you troubleshoot for sure. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what's going on and what we're seeing here. Because clearly, we're no longer seeing our little app. We're seeing this Hello World component, and the Hello World component is telling us, okay, well, what is the Hello World component is essentially showing us that we're seeing a different component than what we were previously seeing. And the reason why is because if we go back to this main.jsx router, we see that there is this element that's being returned, div hello world, right? Well, the way that React Router works, sorry, I'm just troubleshooting something in the chat. But the way that React Router works is it takes in a path and then it gives an element. So what is this path thing, right? Well, the path is going to correlate to what is the actual string value that is going to be in our browser URL at a given point in time. So naturally, when you don't put slash blah, 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 right, inside of the URL, right, the default route is just a regular slash, right? The index, the root route of any application, whatever it is that name URL or that port number with the slash, right? So you can think of it like inside of our code here, what we are seeing is we're saying, hey, at the root route, when the app first loads, this is the path that we're going to be on. This is the element that we want to see, right? If I want to show a different route, right, then I can create another route here and I can say, hey, but if we have a different path, right, and that path is something like slash about or something, right, then I can create another element and that element might just say, that element might be slightly different, right? So if I do this and save this and go back to our application as well, right? Now, if I go to slash about in the browser, right? You can see that now I'm seeing about me, right? Instead of, if I go back to the slash, clearly we're seeing hello world, right? So what we're seeing here is that the path of the actual application will correspond to a completely different component that is going to be rendered here. And that's what's possible using the React Router DOM components. For us, right, we don't necessarily want, we might not want to have it be the case that, hey, we're just defining these little basic JSX elements, right? Maybe when the root route is called, I want to actually show somebody my app, right? So here I can define as an element this component that I have for the app. So when I save this and go back to our screen, well, now I'm back in the app that we used to, right? That app is still doing some dynamic things. But if I go up to the top and I add slash about back in here, well, now I'm still at this second component that is here, right? So hopefully y'all are starting to see a little bit of where we can go with this, right? Now we have the ability to not only change the URL at the top and show a different component, but we can also render components that have the same level of dynamic state and props and whatnot as we had before in order to create various interactions inside of these particular components, right? So first things first, go ahead and in your main.jsx, add a new route or as many new routes as you want to try out and add some different elements and save and go ahead and play around with that in the browser. And when you have created like a router with a couple different paths, please just raise your hand so I know that y'all are rocking with me, and we'll do our last little bit for today, messing around with these routers. All right, y'all. Well, hopefully you had some time to play around, add another route or two into your main.jsx. And if not, you'll take some time maybe a little later and you can knock that out. Okay, so you're like, yeah, I did that, my bad. Appreciate y'all. So cool. So now that we have the ability to make routing happen in the app, right? Well, let's talk about how maybe we can change like what's going on in our app.jsx so that instead of having kind of just this simple situation where we're just changing the message, right? Maybe we can use some of what we have here to start the process of linking people to these multiple pages in React components, right? And the reality is that the React Router DOM library does make this fairly simple, right? So here's how this will work. So let's go back to our main.jsx. Essentially, when we create a router in React Router DOM, we're going to provide it some various routing elements, some paths. Whenever a path is being created, right, the way that the router works is it's going to take a look at the path inside of our URL, and it's going to try to match this path with the actual paths that we've defined. If it matches the path to one of the paths we've defined, routes to one of the paths we've defined, it will return that particular component's element, that particular element for that router. So it works by way of reading the path values and saying, hey, based on the path you're at, or somebody typed in or navigated to, let's show them a particular element. So naturally, we can continue to add elements by just giving them a variety of different paths. Again, there's also some very cool features built into the React Router DOM library that we won't talk about today per se, but I will give y'all as resources to look at. Other ways of making even more dynamic paths, which is important to know as well. But again, we'll talk about that in a separate time. For now, let's talk about, though, how if we did have a router that had a couple paths defined in it, right? How might we be able to create the internal work of an application to handle all of this? So let's do a couple small things before we wrap up for this particular session. So first thing is, let's actually turn, instead of having this be just kind of a simple div, let's make this about page like an actual little component. So to do that, we can just go ahead and say either inside of our components folder, right? We have a couple options here based on what we want to accomplish. And this goes back to, again, like something we talked about last time, right? we could theoretically create a new component and put it in a folder called components, right? But I'm feeling a little bit different about the about component than I was about the message component. And here's why, right? Well, the about component is not necessarily just any component. It's actually a page, right? That page might have a number of components on it, but it itself kind of represents a page for me. Well, the cool thing is I don't have to put this in the components folder. Matter of fact, this components folder doesn't even really exist until I create it. One thing you'll see as you're working on more sophisticated React projects with different pieces of code and components and whatnot is that the organization of the file starts to become an important part of making sure your applications are easy to understand and scale. So one tip that you'll see people do is they'll create a components folder maybe for certain types of smaller components, and they'll create a pages folder for components that are a little bit more sophisticated. They're like they're larger components that will have on them a number of smaller components, for instance, right? So I'm going to actually create a new folder called pages, and inside of that, I'm going to create my about.jsx. And the about.jsx is just going to be a new page for me. I'm going to create a new functional component for it. I'm going to make sure I export that component so that I can bring it into another file. And then all I got to do is return some JSX in here. And just to make things cool, I'm going to borrow some of what we had in, well, no, there's not much going on there. So I'll just kind of write out a very simple little about page component. Here I'll have the div, and then like I said, because this is a page, maybe I will make use of some of my already created components like my message, right? So maybe I'll import that message component and I will render in my return a new message, right? And that message might, again, have some data. And that data might just say, welcome to our about page, right? Yeah, for now, we can leave that as that, right? This about page component is just basically pulling in this message from this component that we made for messages. And I'm just doing this not because it's really that stylistically necessary, but just to show that, hey, this about page might be made up of a number of smaller components. And so we make this page, we export it. And now that we have another component, inside of our main.jsx, right, where I was rendering this router, I might want to actually bring in now my about page. So I would say import about from /pages/about.jsx. And now this about route, instead of rendering this small div, I can render my about component, right? And say, hey, when the about page gets clicked, take them to the about component. And then if I go back to our little application and I say, okay, go into the URL and I say /about, well, now I can see our about page. It's showing up with some of that same styling that was coming default into our app.jsx with our code here. So this is cool, right? So now we kind of have at least a little bit more consistency around what we're seeing when we go to each different page. To make this even more the case, I'm going to go back to the code, and inside of the code, I want to now make sure that I, inside of the app, let's swap this app up a little bit just to make it so that it's clear what's going on here. So I'm just going to go ahead and just, instead of saying no option selected, I'm just going to change this to say choose a page. And then if I go back to our home page route, I just see choose a page. Clearly, home, about us, dashboard are still buttons based on what I had changed a little bit earlier. So how now might I be able to make it so that instead of this saying home, about us, dashboard, and just kind of changing the messages like we were doing before, how can I make it maybe so that if one of these gets clicked, it actually will take somebody to our About Us page, right? Just kind of like a navigation, take us to our About Us. Well, the good news is I can do this fairly simply in the using the React Router DOM library. So let's take a look at how we can do that. So we're going to go back to our code and look into our app.jsx, right, where this kind of interaction is taking place right now. What I want to do is essentially I want to create a link that will allow for us to essentially create an opportunity for us to move from one particular page to another page, or one route to another route. To do that, I can use the link object that is built into the React Router DOM package. So there's a component called a link that is able for us to essentially do what we would do with a regular anchor, but it is a component that will allow for us to add it to our JSX, and then it will be aware of the various routes that we've defined and allow for us to to link people to some of the different paths that we have defined in our application. So by importing this link component, now I can use the link component in my app page. So here I can say, all right, bet. Well, on this page, right, we have a couple of buttons, and those buttons are currently we did some on-click stuff, and the on-click stuff is doing all of this stuff to take a look at what's going on, setting the state, and doing all these really interesting things. Again, remember, I was showing you this to show you how conditional rendering works in general, but I was telling you, hey, one of the benefits of using the React Router DOM library is that they're going to do all this stuff for us. So here's what we would need to do in order to create a little link for ourselves with these buttons, instead of just having them do what they're doing now. To create a link, first thing we do is we import that link component object. And the next thing I want to do is I need to basically create the link. And the link can be anything. It can be any component. So I might say, hey, I want these buttons to be links to the different pages. So to do that, I just have to say, okay, let me find which button I want to link and link that particular button's page, link that particular button to the route that I want. So I have 3 buttons right now. One that says home, one that says about us, one that says dashboard. Clearly, I only really have my about component ready. So I'm going to go ahead and just put a link around the, I'm going to put a link component around the about us button that we have here. So it'll look a little something like this. So this link is a component, right? And inside of the link, you can see I moved the button so that it's now being wrapped by this link component. So it opens and it closes around the around the particular thing I want to make a link. So that's the second thing. First thing was import it. The second thing is create the link based on what element I want to make a link. And I could make it this button. I could make some text. I could make whatever I want a link. And next, the last thing I need to do is tell this link, where is it linking people to? What is the path that I want this button to link someone to, right? And that particular path is going to correspond to the route paths that we defined here. So I'm going to say, hey, I want this particular link to route somebody to /about, right? And of course, this is still a button. It still has this on click and all of this stuff that we defined earlier. But let's take a look at what happens when we save this and go back to our code, right? So going back to our code now, right? I'm going to just refresh, right? Choose a page. We have home. We have about us, dashboard. All of this still looks the same. And clearly, these are still buttons. Nothing visually has changed. But now, if I go ahead and click up, or if I hover over about us, you might see it very small at the bottom. There's not a good way for me to zoom in on this without moving the cursor. But at the bottom there, you can see a route is popping up that says localhost 5173/about. That is showing me that this is clearly going to link me somewhere. If I click this, now the button is actually routing me to the component for the about page that we had defined in the routes. If y'all see what I'm saying here, and y'all like, oh, that's kind of lit. Give me a thumbs up. You know what I'm saying? That's kind of fire, right? You know what I'm saying? Like that's kind of dope, right? That's kind of lit, right? That's pretty dope right there. So now we have the capability of saying, all right, cool. So theoretically, if I want to finish this all up, right, I could use this same component and the stuff that we already have in order to make it so I can route somebody to another page. And so to do that, what I'm going to do, let's just go back to the VS Code and let's say, okay, boom, I want to link somebody now to the dashboard, right? Well, I want to create a new dashboard page. So I'll do dashboard.jsx. Inside of here, just to save myself some time, I'm just going to copy this from the about page and change this to say dashboard, right? And now in the main.jsx, right, where I'm doing all my routes, I can say, okay, cool. So now let's import my dashboard from /pages/dashboard, dashboard.jsx, right? So now I have my about page, my dashboard page, and all I need to do now is add another route for my dashboard. So I say path, dashboard, comma, and then the element will be my dashboard component. So now I have 3 components created. If I save this, go ahead and go back to the app, right? The last thing I should have done while I was in there, is inside of the app.jsx where I have these links, I can create another link here. And again, the link will say, hey, what do you want to make a link? So I'm going to make this button a link by nesting it like this. And then each link takes a value for where it's going to navigate someone to. So I'm going to say this is going to navigate somebody to /dashboard. And now I should have 2 routes working. So I can say, hey, go to About Us. And we just saw that, right? And then I can say, hey, go to the dashboard. And now I'm like, okay, boom, we're at the dashboard, right? Now, clearly, if I want to make this an even better navigation system, right, I could make a nav bar component, right, that now I can share across this app. So what might that look like? Well, let's go back to our code and just say, well, theoretically, you know, it's not like necessarily the prettiest nav bar, but we have in our app.jsx, right, we kind of have a little nav bar situation taking part that's kind of working right now in these buttons, right? So if I were to actually create a link around this and I say link to slash to just say someone's going to link to the home page, right? And I say, okay, now I have this link that is linking to the home page, to the about page, to the dashboard page, right? What I mean by, oh, we kind of have a navigation system already. Well, if I just copy this div that has all 3 of these links in there, right? I could copy this and inside, let's say I do it in the about page first, just to show you what I mean. If inside of here, I go ahead and put these, let's see, why did that tweak on me? If I go ahead and put these buttons in here, right, and wrap it in another div so that it's easier to close, right? So now I just added those same 3 links to my about page. Only thing that this situation is missing is, hey, like these buttons kind of defined an on click that clearly doesn't exist. So for now, let's just get rid of the on click because we're not even using the button on click anymore. We're just using kind of the regular buttons. So I'll just get rid of these. And what you'll see is now if I go to my about page, ooh, my bad, fam. Let's go back. And let's make sure link to this, I got to import the link from React-Router DOM. So now that this link knows that that's a link, and with that, everything should work. So if I go there, go to the about page, boom. So now I still keep this little navigation and I can go back to the home page, right? If I go back to about, right? And now I can say, oh, well, if I want to go to the dashboard, boom. But the dashboard clearly doesn't have that in there yet. So I could say, all right, let's just copy this little div and make a little navigation for ourselves in the dashboard. Same thing. So here, just do this. Make sure I import the link from React-Router DOM right? And now the dashboard page also has this navigation. So now I can navigate to all of the different pages, much like I would expect in any other application. Finally, just to top it all off, well, you see I'm repeating this code a whole bunch, these links and stuff. What I might do is say, oh, well, let me make this a component. So I can say something like nav.jsx. And here I can say function nav, make a new component that I can use that's just going to return that little navigation for me. So here I might import the link from React-Router DOM, like I just did, and then paste this div with all these links here, right? Exporting this, export default nav, right? Then I now have a navigation component that will make it even easier for me to say, all right, boom. Well, instead of having to return all of this stuff in the actual component itself, right? I can say, well, I can now just say, okay, well, we're going to clearly have our message component and whatnot in the dashboard, but now I can just import the nav from our component. So dot slash components slash nav, right? We'll have the navigation component that I just created, right? So now I can just say, all right, boom. So now I can make it even more reusable by just using a reusable component instead of having to have all of those things do the same. And as you can see, if I replace the dashboard, if I replace if I replace it inside of the about page, right? Let's just get this away. And I replace it in our app, same thing. Right, so now I have all three of them with that reusable component. And as I refresh, right, clearly, welcome to our home page, about us page, dashboard page, and we have these nice reusable components being used. We have 3 pages, about page, dashboard page, and technically our app.jsx, where we could have made a home page and put it in the pages directory. We now have this nav that has some links to different pages, right? We're just using the link to navigate us to these different things. And inside, and this is all working because inside of our router, in the main.jsx, we've defined the necessary routes for our application to use to navigate. Each has a path and a particular element or a component that is being rendered that we're pulling back from our application in order to show this stuff through our router provider. So with that, we have a really dope functioning app. I appreciate y'all for your time. And this is the React-Router DOM library. So hopefully y'all can use this to start making some really cool multi-page sites. Thank you for your time and your attention. If you learned something and enjoyed it, show me some love. And otherwise, I will talk to you.